Chapter 23. Luke's Gospel. Let us now approach the third evangelist. I shall not make so large a demand upon your time in the cases of St. Luke and St. John as in that of St. Mark. What reply are we able to make to those assertions of Strauss that nobody knows who Luke was, or when or where the third Gospel was written? Is Luke a mere man in the moon, a shadow without any historical identity? Is the author of the third Gospel a mere ignoramus who knows nothing about the history of Christ, and therefore can tell us nothing? If that be the opinion of Strauss, we immediately reply it was not the opinion of Luke himself. In the 16th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, we have the author speaking in the first person plural, as we say, "We endeavored to go into Macedonia. We came with a straight course to Samothracia. We were in that city," that is to say, Philippi, certain days, and so on. The author is with Paul, is one who obeys the divine signal given to Paul of the man of Macedonia in a vision, saying, "Come over and help us," and so, doubtless, hears Paul preach the first Christian sermon ever preached in Europe. Further on in the Acts of the Apostles, he tells us that he was with Paul in the voyage he made amongst the Greek islands, and to Tyre, and Ptolemais, and Caesarea, and how he went with him to Jerusalem. The day following, the author of the Acts himself also tells us he went in with Paul to James, and all the elders were present. He is thus a personal eyewitness of the real existence of the apostles of Christ, and undoubtedly would hear them speak in that meeting at Jerusalem and give their advice to Paul. As we draw nearer the end of the Acts of the Apostles, the author of it informs us that he sailed with Paul in that long and dangerous voyage in the Mediterranean by Cyprus and Crete, and across the Adriatic to Malta, and from thence to Syracuse, and thence to Rome, and there he concludes by describing to us how Paul, as a prisoner, dwelt 2 whole years in his own hired house, and preached Christ to all who would come and hear him. Whoever the author of this Acts of the Apostles may be, he is, like the apostle to whom he is attached, a man of earnestness and of action, and is a very likely man to write, not only this stirring narrative of the life of Paul, preceded by a brief account of the doings of Christ's earlier disciples, but to write some account of the life of Christ himself. And he points us to the fact that he did write such an account in the very first words of the Acts of the Apostles. "The former treatise I have made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach, until the day in which he was taken up," and so on. We turn to the former treatise. How does it begin? "Forasmuch as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they are delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee, in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed." So then, the author of the third Gospel begins it with the bold challenge that he had perfect understanding of all things from the very first. Strauss must have been very bold, must he not, if he really asserted that Luke knew nothing of the history of Christ, had no certain information, or could give us none, about Christ's words and deeds. For that Luke is the name of the author of the Acts of the Apostles and of the third Gospel, we have the direct testimony of Irenaeus and Tertullian in the close of the 2nd century, and their evidence is corroborated by the testimonies of Origen, Eusebius, and numerous fathers that follow. Justin Martyr also, let it be observed, repeatedly quotes St. Luke's Gospel as well as St. Matthew's, and he wrote in the first half of the 2nd century. Justin does not mention the name either of Luke or of Matthew, but it is certain that he quotes both Gospels very frequently. He does not mention either of their names, because their names would not only be unknown to the person he addresses, but would be no evidence to them of the truth of what he was writing to prove. One stray thought before I pass on. Marcion, in the 2nd century, attempted the mischievous prank of mutilating the Gospel of Luke, and pretended that the Christian Church did not read the genuine Gospel. Tertullian's book against the mutilator has come down to us, and it contains this strong sentence after he has enumerated several churches which were founded by the apostles. I affirm then that in those churches, and not in those only which were founded by the apostles, but in all which have fellowship with them, that the gospel of Luke, which we so steadfastly defend, has been received from its first publication. You see, my friends, the belief of the early church in the genuineness and authenticity of the Gospels was not allowed to lie in their minds as an idle, slumbering persuasion. They were put upon their mettle to defend their precious possession of these Gospels even in the 2nd century of our era. And, 'pon honor, I think they were all the better Christians for it. Irenaeus tells his readers that he who rejects Luke will be convicted of throwing away the gospel of which he professes himself a disciple. For there are many, and those very necessary parts of the gospel, which we know by Luke's means, says Irenaeus, and then he goes on to mention the facts and parable recorded by Luke which are not recorded by the other evangelists, such as the information respecting the Holy Family and the family of John the Baptist in Luke's opening chapters, the testimony of Simeon and Anna, Christ's questioning of the doctors when he was but 12 years of age, the age of our Lord when he was baptized, the miraculous draught of fishes, the cure of the woman who had been bowed down with an infirmity of 18 years, the cure of the man with the dropsy on the Sabbath day, the parable of the man who knocked at the door in the night time for bread, the deed of the woman that was a sinner in kissing his feet and anointing him in the house of the Pharisee, the parables of the rich man who hoarded up his increase, and of the creditor who had 2 debtors, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the conversation of Zacchaeus the publican, the parable of the publican and the Pharisee praying in the temple, the healing of the 10 lepers, the parables of the judge who yielded to the importunate widow, and of the barren fig tree. And is all this attested by one who wrote in the latter half of the 2nd century? Can there be a stronger proof that the Gospel of Luke, which Irenaeus had in his hands 1700 years ago, and only 150 years after Christ died and rose again, was the same Gospel of Luke that we have in our hands now? The attachment of St. Luke to St. Paul seems to have been very strong and true. In the great apostle's last letter which has reached us, the 2nd epistle to Timothy, which is believed to have been written from his last Roman prison, but a few months before his martyrdom in the year 68, St. Paul urges Timothy to come to him and bring Mark with him, for Demas, he sorrowfully says, has forsaken him through love of the present world, and Crescens and Titus are gone. Only Luke, he adds touchingly, only Luke is with me. Luke is also mentioned by St. Paul as one of his fellow laborers in his letter to Philemon. But you will remember that, in St. Paul's letter to the Colossian church, Luke is mentioned with others as among the friends who visit him in his first Roman prison, and he is called Luke, the beloved physician. He is not called a painter. That popish story is only an invention of the 14th century. It has no foundation whatever in the testimony of the ancients. Eusebius and Jerome in the 4th century assert that Luke was a physician of Antioch, the city, you know, where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. A physician? Some will say. A physician? Then Luke ought to be a better scholar than a mere fisherman. Just so. And St. Luke's Greek is the best Greek of the Gospels. You know it could not be expected that Jews should speak or write what is called classic Greek. If they wrote or spoke in Greek words, the mode and term of expression would indicate a Jewish, not a Greek cast of thought. Thus the New Testament is always said to consist of Hebraistic or Hellenistic Greek. Luke's Greek, however, is purer than the Greek of the other Gospels. Nay, the 4 verses which I quoted you from our authorized version, the 4 verses with which Luke's Gospel begins are, in the original, the purest and most classic Greek in the entire New Testament. Let me not forget to say that these 4 verses are followed by a passage of considerable length, which you must not include in the chapter I have just given of Luke's Greek. From the 5th verse of the 1st chapter to the end of the 2nd chapter, Luke's style is so Hebraistic that it has been shrewdly conjectured by some scholars that we have here a document entrusted to him by the Holy Family, and he translates it for us, preserving the peculiar cast of thought, as much as possible, in his Greek translation from the Hebrew. St. Paul does not include Luke among those who are of the circumcision, when he calls him the beloved physician. Luke is therefore a Gentile, born at Antioch, says Eusebius, and he does not give the genealogy of Christ in the way that Matthew gives it. That is to say, by shewing that Jesus was descended from David and Abraham, and thus was the Messiah the Jews had been taught to look for. Instead of this, he imitates the Gentile method of tracing genealogies, and beginning with Christ himself, traces his line up to Adam. I cannot take up your time here by showing how the differences in the two genealogies are to be explained, but I can refer you to a book which I have read over 4 times, with the increasing satisfaction that it solves the whole difficulty. Let me recommend all who have any unsettledness on this question to read the work of a venerable clergyman still living, the Reverend Lord Arthur Hervey. Talking of difficulties in the Gospels, let me also note that the objection so often urged against the third Gospel, respecting Cyrenius or Quirinius being governor of Syria when the taxing or enrollment was first made, which caused Joseph and Mary to go up from Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem to be taxed or enrolled, has also been swept away by a great living scholar. It was always alleged that since the government of Syria by Quirius did not commence till 10, or as some said 12 years after the birth of Christ, the author of the third Gospel was not and could not be Luke, the companion of Paul, but some compiler in the 2nd or 3rd century who was not well up in his chronology. Even the critical Strauss sings that old song. Now, however, Dr. Zumpt of Berlin, whose reputation as a scholar stands among the foremost of our time, has shown, to the satisfaction of all who are best qualified to judge, that Publius Sulpicius Quirius was governor of Syria from the year 4 before Christ to the year 1 after Christ, and again from A.D. 6 to A.D. 11. But Luke was a physician, we have seen from the testimony of St. Paul himself, and the tradition reported by Eusebius and Jerome, and none of you can read Luke's Gospel thoughtfully and regard the testimony and report as untrue. St. Luke records more miracles of healing than any other of the evangelists. He takes more time to describe them, and evidently feels more interest in describing them than any of the other evangelists. Nay, but we can come nearer to the proof that it was a physician who wrote the third Gospel. Only here again I am straitened in attempting to give you the proof, because you young men, who might so easily do it, will not learn to read your Greek Testament. St. Luke uses words which are not in the other evangelists. Neither are they words common to Xenophon and Thucydides, and other so-called classic writers. They are medical words, such as are in use by Greek medical writers only. You will remember how, in the Acts of the Apostles, when Elmias, the sorcerer, opposed God's work, he was told by Paul he should be blind for a season, and immediately, the narrative goes on, there fell on him a mist and a darkness, and he went about seeking someone to lead him by the hand. The very picture presented so livingly in one of Raphael's cartoons. The word translated mist is explained by Galen, a Greek medical writer who comes after Luke's time, and he says that those who are afflicted with the disorder of the eye so called seem to see through a sort of mist or fog. The peculiar word rendered surfeiting in the 21st chapter of St. Luke is used by Hippocrates, another well-known Greek medical writer. Again, Matthew, Mark, and John do not describe the persons stricken with the palsy in the manner that Greek medical writers describe them. The 3 evangelists always use the word paralytic. St. Luke uses the mode of expression common to Greek medical men, the perfect participle of the passive voice, meaning paralyzed. Another remarkable token that it is the hand of a physician who is employing the pen in the third Gospel is the use of the term seized with or taken with in the way that the Greek medical writers use it. Thus we read in St. Luke that Simon's wife's mother was taken with a great fever, and the Greek word I have just mentioned is employed again in the Acts of the Apostles to describe the sickness of the father of Publius, the chief man of the island of Melita or Malta. But St. Luke was a gentleman as well as a physician. He will not let his profession down. When the earnest, unpolished Peter preached, we learn from Mark's Gospel that he described the woman who had an issue of blood 12 years as one who had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. St. Luke does not deny that she could not be healed of any, but he does not say she grew worse. He will not let his profession down. Nor does he give the rough hint that Peter seems to give, that it is a suffering experiment to put yourself into the hands of physicians. Dr. Friend also shows us that the educated physician, St. Luke, employs a more temperate word in the delicate Greek to show how the lady expended her wealth on physicians, than the rough, boisterous word used by Peter, which indicates luxurious and riotous waste, and is the word used by St. Luke to express the wasteful spending of the prodigal son. In conclusion, let me say that several of the fathers say that Luke wrote his gospel in Greece. Luke's gospel, being called by himself the former treatise, must have been written before his Acts of the Apostles, and as the Acts do not relate to Paul's martyrdom, but leaves Paul in his first imprisonment at Rome under Nero, we must conclude with the judicious Lardner that Luke left Paul for a time at Rome and went into Greece to compose or finish the composition of his gospel and the Acts, not later than A.D. 64 or 65. I think I am now entitled to affirm that neither Strauss nor any other rejecter of Christianity can be proclaiming truth when he says nobody knows who Luke was. Nobody knows who wrote the gospel now called by his name. Nobody knows when it was written. Nobody knows where it was written.